these vaccines that we currently have, the two mRNA vaccines of Pfizer and Moderna that are approved or authorized by the FDA, and the Johnson & Johnson or J&J vaccine, as I'll call it, that's been authorized by the FDA as well. They have undergone some incredible safety monitoring. In fact, the COVID vaccines themselves, as we've rolled them out and over the past year of their use, or near year of their use, have undergone some of the most extensive safety monitoring we've had in any vaccines in U.S. history. It's pretty intensive. We've had nearly 400 million people now that have been vaccinated in the U.S. Or that have received these vaccine doses and have participated in safety monitoring. We had tens of thousands of people participate in clinical trials before these vaccines were even authorized by the FDA. So there's quite a bit of data to look at. That data resoundingly tells us that there are certain common things that happen, like short-term side effects. So if for those of you who've been vaccinated, you may have heard, well, you might get a sore arm, you might feel wiped out, you might have a little bit of a fever or a headache. Most of those times, those symptoms last 1 to 3 days. They may be a little longer in somebody who has some underlying health condition that causes them to have those symptoms for a few days longer. But for the most part, those resolve, they're short term, and we can bear through it for the protection that those vaccines then offer us and our community. There is concern that's been expressed by the public about long-term complications related to these vaccines. The main issues that we've seen thus far are anaphylaxis, which is a very rare occurrence after getting the vaccine. And we are prepared for every jurisdiction's different, and there's many different sites where you can go get vaccine. But if you're here in St. Mary's County, the St. Mary's County Health Department has been the primary mechanism of getting vaccinated for COVID, and we run a mass vaccine site. So at our mass vaccine site, we have ambulances, we have nurses and doctors there that have EpiPens on them. And in the rare occasions where we've had an anaphylaxis situation in somebody who had the vaccine, they've been stabilized, they've been evaluated, they're doing fine. And so there's a very low likelihood of that anaphylaxis leading to some kind of permanent long-term problem. And all these vaccine sites, the majority of these vaccine sites are very adept at responding or being prepared to respond if a situation arises related to anaphylaxis. The other issue that has been in the news that people have heard about is like a clotting problem that happens in very rarely in some individuals who received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in particular. And I believe the incidence of that is about 7 out of a million. So 7 people out of a million people, 7 out of a million women between the ages of 18 and 49. So that's a much more narrow group of that risk experienced this clotting disorder that led to significant issues. But that is a very rare occurrence. It was only associated thus far with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it was primarily associated with women in that 18 to 49 age group. The risk for women over 50, the risk for men was much, much lower for that kind of very rare complication. So those are the main issues that have come about. There's also been some attention to the issue of inflammation of the heart or inflammation of the lining of the heart. So myocarditis or pericarditis is what we call it in primarily young adolescent males or young adult males after receiving their second dose of one of the mRNA vaccines, either the Pfizer or the Moderna. That also is a very rare occurrence. It is something that's continually being evaluated. We have determined that the occurrence of that after vaccine is much less likely than the occurrence of the same conditions if you got COVID infection. So we've also seen inflammation of the heart and inflammation of the lining of the heart associated with getting infected with COVID. And the risk of getting those health conditions because of COVID are much higher than a risk of getting that because of a vaccine. and again, primarily the second dose of the vaccine in that concentrated demographic. What we have also seen in following the cases of individuals who did have that very rare complication after the vaccine, that most of those situations were very mild. Most did not require hospitalization or in any type of intensive care, and resolved on their own. They're typically self-limited and were able to resolve on their own in a short period of time. At this point in time, we have not identified any long-term complications of these vaccines, of these COVID vaccines that we currently have, aside from what I just talked about. And most of what I just talked about are like the myocarditis can resolve on their own or not necessarily become a long-term complication. The risk of getting long-term complications from COVID, or what we're calling long COVID, is certainly there. In fact, the World Health Organization just put out about 10 to 20% of people who get COVID infection end up with some of these longer term symptoms. And we don't know yet how long those symptoms are going to last. Things like brain fog and fatigue and maybe even painful tingling in your hands and feet, loss of taste or smell. There have been people who had COVID infection that are dealing with those long-term symptoms, shortness of breath, decreased ability to exercise or to be an athlete, and they're dealing with all of these things. And the risk for that is definitely something that we've recognized more and more. But with these vaccines, we have not seen the risk for these long-term complications. And in fact, the way vaccines are made, if there are going to be side effects from vaccines, they're typically seen within the first 6 weeks after receiving the vaccines. We haven't seen side effects all of a sudden appear years down the road because of a vaccine that's new. And so this is, we're continuing to do intensive safety monitoring on all of these vaccines, of course, because they are new, and that's what we should do anytime we roll out a new vaccine. But it's been several months, and hundreds of millions of people have received the vaccine, and we thus far have shown pretty solid safety data associated with these vaccines, and we're pretty confident that it will remain that way.